She kept telling me I was imagining things, that I was tired, paranoid, looking for problems where none existed. And for a long time, I believed her. Because when the person you trust the most looks you in the eyes and calmly says, "There's nothing wrong," you start doubting your own memories, your instincts, even your sanity. I told myself I was overthinking, that love doesn't lie to you like that. But then a single piece of paper arrived. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my life, my relationship, and myself quietly collapsed. At first, it wasn't a thought. It was a feeling. Subtle, uncomfortable, easy to ignore if you wanted to. I couldn't point to a single moment and say, this is where it started. There was no argument, no discovery, no dramatic scene. Just a quiet sense that something in my life had shifted slightly out of place, like a picture frame hanging just a bit crooked. Nothing obvious, nothing anyone else would notice. But once I felt it, I couldn't stop seeing it. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying ordinary moments from the day, conversations that seemed normal on the surface, but felt oddly hollow in retrospect. A smile that came a second too late, a response that sounded rehearsed instead of natural. Small things, embarrassingly small, the kind of details you'd feel ridiculous bringing up out loud. So I didn't. I told myself this was what long-term relationships look like. That comfort eventually replaced excitement, that not every silence meant something was wrong. I'd heard all of that before. Everyone has. And for a while, those explanations worked. They were easier than admitting I felt uneasy for no clear reason. But the feeling didn't go away. It followed me through my routines, while brushing my teeth, while driving to work, while sitting across from her at the table, listening to her talk about her day. I'd nod, smile, respond at the right moments, all while a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispered that I was missing something important. The strange part was that nothing was technically wrong. There were no secrets I knew of, no sudden changes in behavior, no late nights, no suspicious messages, no dramatic red flags. If someone had asked me to explain why I felt the way I did, I wouldn't have been able to give them a single concrete reason. And that made it worse, because when you can't explain your doubt, it starts to feel like a personal failure. Like maybe you're just insecure, maybe you're projecting old fears onto someone who doesn't deserve it. I'd been told before that I tend to overanalyze, that I sit with thoughts too long, that I look for meaning where there isn't any. So I tried to correct myself. Whenever that uneasy feeling surfaced, I pushed it down. I reminded myself of all the reasons I trusted her, of all the years we'd built together, of all the moments that proved she cared. I treated my doubt like an unwanted guest, acknowledged it briefly, then showed it the door. But doubt doesn't leave just because you ask it to. It waits, quietly, patiently, and it grows stronger every time you pretend not to hear it. I didn't know it then, but that feeling wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagination. It was the first crack in something I believed was unbreakable. And once it appeared, no amount of reassurance could make it disappear completely. If you had asked anyone around us how we were doing, they would have smiled before answering. The kind of smile that says the question itself feels unnecessary. From the outside, our life made sense. It was stable, predictable in a good way. We had routines, shared responsibilities, inside jokes that only worked between us. The kind of relationship people quietly compare theirs to, even if they don't admit it. We showed up together to family gatherings. We knew which stories the other had already told, and which ones needed a gentle interruption before they went on too long. We argued occasionally, but nothing explosive. Just the normal friction that comes from sharing a life with someone for a long time. That's what made everything so confusing. Because when something is visibly broken, you're allowed to question it. You're allowed to feel unsettled. But when everything looks fine, when it looks better than fine, you start wondering if the problem is you. She was consistent, attentive in the ways that mattered. She remembered important dates, asked about my day, noticed when I was quiet. If I pulled away emotionally, she leaned in. If I seemed distracted, she'd joke about it, lightening the mood without pressing too hard. It was impossible to reconcile that version of her with the unease I felt. There were moments when I'd catch myself studying her without realizing it. The way she spoke, the way she listened, the expression she made when she thought no one was watching. I wasn't looking for proof of anything specific. I didn't even know what I was looking for at all. I just felt this need to observe, as if my instincts were trying to gather information my mind refused to acknowledge. And every time, I came up empty. Nothing about her behavior screamed deception. Nothing contradicted the image of the life we'd built. In fact, the more I paid attention, the more ridiculous my doubts felt. I'd sit there thinking, look at this. This is what trust looks like. This is what commitment looks like. So why couldn't I relax? I started comparing our relationship to others, quietly, internally. Friends who were constantly fighting, couples who barely spoke to each other, stories about betrayal, secrets, and sudden endings. Compared to all of that, what we had seemed solid, almost boring in its stability. And maybe that was part of the problem. There's a strange kind of guilt that comes with questioning something good. It feels ungrateful, self-sabotaging, like you're searching for cracks just to prove you were right to be uneasy. I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to ruin something real because of an abstract feeling I couldn't explain. So I played my role. I laughed when I was supposed to. I made plans for the future without hesitation. I talked about us with certainty, even when a small part of me hesitated every time the word left my mouth. I convinced myself that whatever I was feeling would eventually pass. After all, everything looked perfect from the outside. And if nothing was wrong on the surface, then maybe the problem wasn't the relationship at all. Maybe it was me. It slipped out in the middle of a normal conversation, the kind you forget 5 minutes later. We were talking about nothing important when I paused, searching for the right words, and finally admitted that I'd been feeling a little off lately. Not unhappy, not angry, just unsettled. I expected concern, or at least curiosity. Instead, she laughed softly and asked if I'd been sleeping enough. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't dismissive in an obvious way. It was casual, almost caring. She told me I'd been under a lot of stress lately, that anyone in my position would feel overwhelmed. Then she squeezed my hand and said I was probably just in my head too much. I remember nodding, relieved in a strange way. If she had an explanation, maybe I didn't have to keep searching for one myself. After that, it happened more often. Anytime I hesitated, anytime I questioned a detail or asked for clarification, she'd gently redirect the conversation. She'd remind me of things I'd supposedly misunderstood. She'd say I was reading too much into situations that were completely normal. Always calm, always reasonable. You're imagining things, she said once, smiling as if it was a joke. I smiled back, even though something about the phrase stuck with me longer than it should have. I started catching myself mid-thought, editing what I was about to say before it ever reached my mouth. I didn't want to sound insecure. I didn't want to seem accusatory. And more than that, I didn't want to be wrong. So when she corrected my memory, I accepted it. When she reframed conversations we'd had, I assumed I'd misremembered. When she assured me nothing was wrong, I took it as confirmation that the unease I felt wasn't worth trusting. After all, she was there. I was inside my own head. The more she dismissed my doubts, the more I began to doubt myself. I started replaying interactions, not to look for hidden meaning, but to check whether my reactions had been exaggerated. I questioned my tone, my timing, my interpretation of her words. It was subtle, but it was constant. I didn't feel manipulated. I felt corrected. There's a difference, and it matters. Being corrected implies you're simply mistaken, not wronged. It makes you grateful instead of defensive. And that gratitude slowly turns into dependence because you start trusting the other person's version of reality more than your own. I noticed I stopped bringing things up altogether. It was easier to stay quiet than to feel embarrassed for worrying over nothing. Easier to accept reassurance than to sit with uncertainty. Each time I swallowed a question, I told myself I was choosing peace. But peace built on silence doesn't feel peaceful for long. Late at night, when everything was quiet, the doubt crept back in. Not louder than before, just more persistent. It didn't accuse. It didn't panic. It simply asked one question over and over again. What if you're not imagining things at all? And that question scared me more than any answer could have. Not in the obsessive way people imagine, where you're constantly watching, constantly accusing. It was quieter than that, more passive. Like my mind had flipped a switch I couldn't turn off, and now it noticed patterns it had previously dismissed as coincidence. The details were insignificant on their own, almost laughable. A pause before answering a question that should have been easy. A story told twice, with slightly different wording each time. A moment of hesitation when I mentioned something we'd already discussed. Nothing I could point to and say, this is it. Nothing dramatic enough to justify the unease. But together, they formed a rhythm I couldn't ignore. I remember one evening in particular. We were sitting together, not talking much, just sharing the same space. I asked a simple question, something ordinary, something that didn't matter. She answered quickly, then stopped herself and added a detail that hadn't been there the first time. She probably didn't even notice. I did. My reaction wasn't suspicion. It was confusion. I felt disoriented, like I'd missed a step going down the stairs. I replayed the moment in my head, trying to decide if I was overanalyzing again. If this was just my mind searching for confirmation of a feeling I'd already decided to distrust. So I let it go. But letting it go didn't erase it. It just filed it away. More moments like that followed. Small inconsistencies that didn't lead anywhere, but didn't fully disappear either. Each one added weight to a growing sense that the version of reality I was being given was slightly curated. Not false, exactly. Just incomplete. The hardest part was that none of it changed how she treated me. She was still kind, still present, still invested. There were no emotional withdrawals, no sudden coldness. If anything, she seemed more attentive when I grew quieter, as if she sensed my distance and wanted to close it. That made me feel worse. Because how do you question someone who shows up for you? How do you justify doubt when the person in front of you seems genuinely concerned about your well-being? Every time she checked in on me, every time she reassured me, it felt like evidence against my own instincts. I started keeping mental notes without meaning to, not because I planned to confront her, but because my mind needed some kind of anchor, something solid, something I could return to later and ask, did this really happen the way I remember it? Even then, I didn't trust those notes completely. I second-guessed them almost as soon as I formed them. I wondered if stress was distorting my perception, if exhaustion was filling in gaps with suspicion. I searched for logical explanations before emotional ones, because logic felt safer. But logic couldn't explain why the unease never fully faded. There was a growing disconnect between what I was experiencing internally and what was being acknowledged externally. The more I tried to align myself with her version of things, the more distant I felt from my own. I wasn't looking for the truth yet. I was still hoping the feeling would disappear on its own if I just ignored it long enough. But some details don't stay quiet forever. And I was starting to realize that ignoring them didn't make them go away, it only made them harder to understand later. I avoided it for as long as I could. There's a certain shame that comes with doubting someone you love, especially when you can't clearly explain why. It feels like a personal flaw, not a legitimate concern. But eventually, carrying everything alone started to feel heavier than the risk of saying something out loud. So I tested the waters. Not with accusations, not with details, just vague statements about feeling disconnected, about sensing that something was off, even though I couldn't put my finger on it. I expected at least one person to pause and say, "Yeah, that sounds strange." Instead, they nodded sympathetically and offered explanations. They told me relationships go through phases, that comfort can feel like distance if you're not careful, that not every uneasy feeling means something is wrong. A few of them smiled and reminded me how lucky I was, how solid we seemed, how well she treated me. Someone even said I was probably just overthinking because I cared too much. It wasn't malicious. No one dismissed me outright, but no one validated me either. Their responses all leaned in the same direction, gently but firmly, pushing me back toward the conclusion I'd been trying to accept on my own, that nothing was wrong. I noticed how often her name came up in those conversations, always followed by praise, how understanding she was, how patient, how emotionally intelligent. Listening to people describe her, it felt like they were talking about a version of my life that existed just slightly out of reach. And maybe they were right. The more people reassured me, the more unreasonable my doubts began to feel. I started editing my own concerns even further, sanding down the edges until they barely resembled what I actually felt. I told myself that if no one else saw a problem, then there probably wasn't one. But there was a cost to that kind of reasoning. Every time someone took her side without hearing the full story, it reinforced the idea that my instincts weren't trustworthy, that my perspective was distorted, that if I kept pushing, I'd be the one causing damage where none existed. I stopped talking about it after that. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still showed up the same way I always had, still played my role, still smiled through conversations that felt slightly disconnected from my inner world. But internally, something shifted. I felt isolated in a way I hadn't before. Not because anyone had done something wrong, but because I realized there was no space for my uncertainty, no room for doubt unless it came with proof. And I didn't have proof. I had feelings. And feelings, apparently, weren't enough. The irony was that the more everyone defended her, the more alone I felt with my thoughts. It wasn't anger, it wasn't resentment, it was a quiet kind of loneliness that settled in and stayed. I began to understand that if the truth ever surfaced, it wouldn't come from reassurance or outside validation. It would have to come from me. And that realization was both terrifying and strangely clarifying. It was resolved, but because I was exhausted from carrying it. Constantly questioning your own perceptions takes more energy than you realize. It wears you down slowly until certainty, any certainty, starts to feel like relief. I told myself I was done chasing a feeling I couldn't explain. I focused on what was tangible, the routines, the shared plans, the future we talked about as if it were already written. I leaned into the stability of it all, convincing myself that this was what commitment required. Trust, even when it felt uncomfortable. For a while, it worked. The unease dulled, not gone, but quieter, manageable. I stopped replaying conversations at night. I stopped scanning for inconsistencies. I allowed myself to believe that I had created a problem out of nothing, and that letting it go was a sign of emotional maturity. There was a strange peace in that decision. I remember thinking that maybe this was just part of growing up, learning to sit with ambiguity, accepting that not every question has an answer, and not every feeling deserves to be investigated. I told myself that if something truly mattered, it would eventually reveal itself. Until then, I would choose trust. She noticed the change before I said anything. She told me I seemed lighter, more present. She said she was glad I wasn't spiraling anymore, and she meant it kindly. Her relief was visible, and seeing that made me feel like I'd done the right thing. I wanted to believe I had, but even in that calmer space, there was a small resistance I couldn't fully silence. A quiet tension that surfaced during still moments, when the house was silent, when we sat next to each other without speaking, when my thoughts had room to wander again. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It was something closer to grief. Grief for a version of myself that trusted his instincts without hesitation. Grief for the clarity I felt I'd given up in exchange for peace. I didn't know what I was mourning exactly, only that something inside me had gone numb to survive. I told myself that numbness was temporary, that it was better than constant doubt. But numbness has a way of sharpening itself over time. And just when I thought I'd finally let everything go, something small and unexpected pulled that familiar thread again. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to remind me that the questions I'd buried were still there, waiting, act of defiance or mistrust in the obvious sense. It wasn't meant to accuse or confront. I wasn't even sure if I needed answers yet. But there was a quiet insistence inside me that refused to be ignored any longer, a need to know beyond doubt, beyond interpretation, beyond anyone else's reassurance. I scheduled the test in secret, just a simple procedure, impersonal, clinical, nothing dramatic, no confrontation, no arguments, no declarations. I told myself it was just a precaution, like double checking a lock on the door or a brake on a bike. Necessary, harmless, invisible to anyone but me. Even as I made the arrangements, a part of me hesitated. What if the results were exactly what I feared? What if I had been wrong? What if I had misunderstood the signs, misremembered details, overreacted to nothing? The possibility terrified me more than the unknown itself. But the other part, the quieter, more insistent part, kept pushing. I had felt off over the past months. Not to build a case, not to prove anything to anyone, just for me, to remind myself that I wasn't imagining everything, even if no one else saw it that way. Every pause, every inconsistency, every minor detail I had dismissed in the name of peace was recorded. Then I mailed the sample, and for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: anticipation. Not hope, not dread, but a hollow kind of suspense that sat in my chest like a weightless stone. I didn't know what I was bracing for, and I didn't try to. I only knew I needed the truth, even if I couldn't yet understand how I would handle it. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell a friend. I didn't mention it to anyone. It was mine to face alone. And I think in some way that secrecy made it feel more real, more urgent. Because when the world around you insists that you're wrong, the only way to preserve your instincts is to act on them quietly, without fanfare, without explanation, without permission. And so I waited. Not with panic, not with hope, not with resentment, just with the strange, hollow weight of expectation, the kind that makes you silently count the days and replay every memory in your mind, wondering if the moment of truth will confirm the whispers or shatter everything you thought you knew. Arrived on a Thursday morning. I remember the exact sound it made when I picked it up from the kitchen counter, a soft, crisp rustle, like the world itself was holding its breath. My hands were steady, but my chest felt heavy, like I had swallowed a stone. I stared at the envelope for what felt like an eternity before finally tearing it open. The results didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a misprint, an error in the paperwork. I read the numbers and letters over and over, scanning for a line that could have been misread. There wasn't one. Every calculation confirmed the same thing. Every test validated the result I had been too afraid to anticipate. And with that realization, the calm world I had tried so desperately to maintain began to unravel. I felt my knees weaken, my vision blur. I gripped the counter as if it could hold the house together while everything inside me collapsed. There was disbelief, certainly. Shock, absolutely. But beneath it all, a quiet, gnawing devastation settled in, slow, deliberate, unrelenting. I wanted to tell someone immediately. But who? No words could prepare them for this. No one could understand why I had waited so long. Why I had chosen to verify what my instincts already knew. Why I had acted in secret. And I wasn't even sure I could fully understand it myself. I reread the results again, slowly, line by line. Every figure, every percentage, every confirmation. Nothing changed. The truth was staring at me, undeniable and merciless. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't even cry. And then the first thought hit me. She knew. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but the realization came with a weight that pressed down on my entire being. The subtle inconsistencies, the pauses, the half-truths, they weren't mistakes. They weren't oversights. They were deliberate, calculated, and I had been blind to it until now. I wanted to look away. I wanted to convince myself it was an anomaly, a clerical error, a hallucination of my tired mind. But the data was cold, concrete, absolute. The person I had trusted completely, the one who insisted I was imagining things, who laughed off my doubts, who made me feel insane for questioning reality, was not who I thought she was. And in that moment, I realized that the world I had been living in was a carefully constructed illusion. Every reassurance, every smile, every gentle correction that once felt caring now carried a sinister weight. Every detail I had recorded in my secret journal was suddenly evidence of a pattern I hadn't yet fully named. And I was left standing there, alone, with nothing but the truth. A truth so devastating, so disorienting, that I wasn't sure I could ever return to the life I had known. I didn't confront her right away, not because I was afraid of her reaction, but because I needed to understand what the truth actually meant before I put it into words. Once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. Once revealed, there would be no pretending anymore for either of us. I carried the results with me for days, not physically, but mentally. Every conversation felt heavier. Every shared moment felt borrowed. I watched her closely, not with suspicion this time, but with a kind of quiet mourning. The person I thought I knew was still there in front of me, laughing, talking, making plans. But now I could see the space between who she was and what she had allowed me to believe. When I finally brought it up, I didn't accuse her. I asked a question. It was calm, almost gentle. I told her I needed honesty, not reassurance, that I needed her to listen without correcting me, without explaining things away. For a brief moment, I saw something shift in her expression, something I hadn't seen before. Not confusion, not concern. Fear. She tried to deflect at first, asked where this was coming from, suggested again that I was spiraling, that I had let my imagination run too far. The words were familiar, comforting, once upon a time. But now they landed differently. So I told her about the test. The room went silent. Not the awkward kind of silence that begs to be filled, but the heavy kind that presses down on your ears. She didn't speak. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even look angry. She just stared at me, her face slowly losing the composure she had always worn so effortlessly. I placed the results on the table between us. She didn't touch them. She didn't need to. Everything she had insisted I was imagining suddenly had a shape, a weight, a permanence that could no longer be talked around. The reality she had been managing for so long had finally reached its limit. I asked her one last time to tell me the truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I expected. Not defensive, not confrontational, just tired. As if she had been carrying the secret for so long that she no longer had the energy to protect it. She admitted what she could no longer deny. Not all at once, not cleanly. The truth came out in fragments, tangled with justifications and explanations I hadn't asked for. She told me when it started, why she hadn't said anything, why she convinced herself it was better this way, why she thought she could manage it without hurting anyone. What hurt the most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing how deliberately she had made me doubt my own reality. She told me she thought she was protecting me, that she believed the truth would destroy everything, and that if she could just keep things stable, keep things quiet, it would all somehow work out. That every time I questioned something, she panicked. And every time she told me I was imagining things, it made it easier to keep going. Listening to her explain, it felt surreal. This wasn't a dramatic confession. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just two people sitting across from each other, one finally exposed, the other realizing how deeply he had been misled. I didn't feel anger the way I expected to. I felt hollow, because the truth didn't just change our relationship, it rewrote my memory of it. Every moment I had doubted myself, every time I apologized for being too sensitive, every reassurance I accepted at face value, all of it took on a different meaning. And I realized something that scared me more than the betrayal itself. She hadn't just lied to me. She had taught me not to trust myself. After the truth came out, the world didn't explode. It didn't shatter with a single dramatic moment. There were no screams, no running out of the house, no immediate declarations of the end. It was quieter than that, subtle, insidious. Like the floor had been pulled out from under me while I was still standing, and I was only realizing it now. Everything felt different. Not just my perception of her, but of myself. I couldn't trust my memories. I couldn't trust my instincts. Every laugh, every touch, every word I had ever accepted as genuine now carried the weight of deception I hadn't been aware of. I went through the motions of daily life, but it felt unreal. Driving to work, making coffee, answering texts, they were all movements without meaning. My own reactions felt scripted, like I was performing in a play I didn't write and didn't understand. She tried to explain. She said she hadn't meant to hurt me, that she had wanted to protect me, that in her mind, the truth was more dangerous than the lie. But the explanation felt hollow. Not because it was untrue, but because the trust it required had been irrevocably fractured. I found myself asking questions I had never imagined I'd ask. Was it better to have known the truth? Was it better to have lived comfortably in ignorance? Was I wrong for seeking the answer even though it destroyed the life I thought I had? I realized that the answers didn't exist in a simple black and white way, that the people around me, the friends, the family, even me couldn't give me permission to feel justified, that the moral weight of this situation was mine alone to carry. And yet, I couldn't ignore it. The DNA test hadn't just revealed a fact. It had forced me to confront the fragility of perception, the limits of trust, and the quiet devastation that comes from realizing that the person you thought you knew the best had, in some way, rewritten your reality without your consent. I sit with that now, quietly, alone in the spaces where life once felt natural. Sometimes I replay moments, trying to determine where the illusion began.
The question I keep returning to is simple yet unbearable: was I wrong to want the truth? Or is she wrong for making me doubt myself so completely? I don't have an answer. And maybe that's the point. Because in the aftermath, it isn't just about betrayal. It's about the space between perception and reality, about the fragile line between trust and doubt, and about learning that some truths change everything, even when you weren't ready for them. And so I wait silently, in a life that feels both familiar and utterly alien, hoping that someday I'll know who was right. Or if anyone ever truly was,